okay, what was the plan? So if your objective is, zero,
vision loss,
vision loss or whatever. Okay. Well, what's our plan to achieve that? So how are we going to do that? Okay. So the plan is this. And so you lay out the steps and how we're going to execute that. And then the next thing for the debrief would be the products for a fighter pilot. And the products is all the paperwork that conveys all the, here's the steps of the plan. So that way, when I'm flying in the jet and I need to quickly reference, like, what was I supposed to do next? Okay, I'm supposed to drop my bomb at this point or whatever, that sort of thing. So I have that from a business perspective. The products would be like the resources that you have available and the tools that you have available to aid you in accomplishing your plan.
Great. Perfect.
So maybe that's a piece of equipment.
I have this test and optic nerve OCT, a visual field, gonioscopy. Perfect. Keep going.
Exactly.
The listeners know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have all that stuff. Those are the what I would call the products, right? Because that helps you identify like a resource issue. Like maybe we don't have the resources to execute our plan.
Hello and welcome to the Chris Wolfe Podcast on iCode Media. Today I had a great conversation with Hoover. I reached out to him a few weeks ago. I have loved his YouTube content for probably a little over a year now. He's a pilot. He's a fighter pilot. But what is super helpful in my perspective from a business standpoint, from an eye care standpoint, is the process of pilot debrief. So please enjoy our conversation. As always, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, write a review, share it with your friends, and support those who support us. The most common questions I get include, what ophthalmological codes or evaluation and management codes should I use? What ICD-10 codes do I need to bill with this CPT code? What CPT codes can be billed together and what can't? And my favorite, how do I manage a patient who has diabetes who comes in for a quote-unquote routine eye exam? These questions really highlight the confusion and uncertainty that serves as a daunting hurdle for providers, makes it more challenging for them to care for their patients and provide those patients with the best opportunity for a lifetime of ocular health and clear vision. That's why we built iCode Education for this specific purpose. Our mission is to provide optometrists with resources to help you understand disease states, revenue cycles, and billing and coding so that you can put that on autopilot and truly care for your patients. Check out iCodeEducation.com. That's EYECODE education.com. We've developed a premier billing and coding bundle that includes all of our billing and coding resources in one place. We also have a 10% discount code just for listeners of this podcast. Enter the coupon code EYECODEMEDIA22 at checkout. We'd love to work with you. Check out iCodeEducation.com. Getting young presbyopes into progressive lenses can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. Verilux Liberty 3.0 lenses are an introductory solution for new and young presbyopes, and they are available in select ad powers. This lens provides all-in-one balanced vision for an accessible and great first-time progressive lens wearing experience. Learn more about Verilux Liberty 3.0 lenses and get free resources to help start the progressive lens conversation with young presbyopes at eslorpro.com/Verilux. So thanks for doing this. And I'll say that, in general, when I think about what I wanted to talk to you about was a couple things. And I think this is helpful with the podcast. The first one is so the reason we developed this podcast before was because I was having conversations all over the country when I would travel with other people that I thought were doing really interesting things. Largely it was within my profession, but I couldn't really translate those conversations when I'd come back to my community and tell them, like, this is what they said, this is what I learned. I was okay at that, but it wasn't the same. And then that's what started the podcast, in 2019. And then selfishly, what I really love about the podcast is if I were to, no matter how nice the person is, if I were to just like email a person and be like, hey, can we have a 1 hour phone call? I really like what you do. Like most people are like, no. And I'm the same way. Like, no way. I'm not going to have a conversation with somebody I don't know for an hour. But selfishly, for the listeners, Hoover, I talked to you about this when I emailed you, but, I've been super excited for this conversation. And mainly because as a general aviation pilot, I really like your perspective about how you take an approach for pilot debriefs, and probably we could talk a little bit about the pilot briefing on the front end.
Sure.
And how that applies to business and even medical practice. I think that's probably really helpful. But selfishly, I want to pick your brain just about aviation in general. So can we spend a little bit of time on the front end talking about aviation, and then we spend time on the back end talking about how that applies to professions?
Yeah. Hopefully I'll be able to answer your questions.
Well, what's interesting to me is, so give us a little perspective, if you would, about kind of your history in aviation. I think you and I are about the same age. And for some perspective for you, I went in before I went to optometry school. I had just graduated from undergrad, and I didn't really know exactly what I did. I took a year off before I started optometry school. I thought I would do that, but I wasn't 100% sure. And so I went to the Air Force recruiter, and I wanted to, like I said, look, I want to be a pilot in the Air Force, or I'd like to maybe be a pilot in the Air Force. And then, of course, as everybody, they think like Top Gun. And they said, well, sorry, kid, we'd only have helicopters for you to fly. And so I took the aptitude test. I thought, helicopters, I'm not going to do that. But you probably were about the same time as me. And was that the story that you had the aptitude for fighter jets?
So the short version of the story is I wanted to get out of my house to go to college, and my parents couldn't afford to send me anywhere. So I applied to all the military academies, and I got accepted at the Air Force Academy. So that started me down that path. Technically I had a full ride scholarship in Florida to any school that I wanted to go to, because it was like a financial needs based program. But I knew that if I accepted that, the only way I could use that would be to stay at home, live at home while I was going to college, because there was no way we were going to be able to afford, living on campus somewhere else. Right. And so it was just not going to be a good decision. So that's why I started pursuing the military options. And then I went to the Air Force Academy. And then at the Air Force Academy, I wanted to be a lawyer when I graduated from there, because at the time, and I still do, I like arguing with people because I'm very stubborn sometimes.
YouTube serves you well then. Do you get into the comments on YouTube?
I do, but I don't argue with people. I let them have their way. But no, I wanted to do that out of the academy. And I quickly learned that the Air Force doesn't really send people to law school, because there's too many attorneys that have already put themselves through law school that need a job somewhere because they can't get hired by a firm. So they go and they join the military to help pay off all those college expenses, and to get some practice, if you will. And then they get out of the service and then go do their legal stuff afterwards. So my only other alternative was, all right, well, what else am I going to do? Well, 75% of my class is going to pilot training. I guess I'll go do that. So I went and did that. And even then I was really hesitant about the flying career, because I guess I'd always thought about doing it maybe, but, I had a year of waiting before pilot training started, just because of like the backlog of class start dates and stuff. And during that time, I was really like contemplating not going, because at the time the Air Force had switched from an 8-year service commitment to a 10-year service commitment for anyone that went through pilot training. So it's like, okay, well, I'll have spent 1 year in the service. Now I go to pilot training for a year. Now I owe them 10 years. So that's then, when you're 21, 22 years old, you're like, I don't know if I want to commit to something for the next 12 years of my life, So,
yeah.
So that was tough. But I said, like, might as well, I don't know what else I'm going to do otherwise. And then I wanted to fly helicopters when I first started.
You were the opposite. Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to fly helicopters because it's all how you're shaped by your instructors, right? And so in that initial phase of pilot training, 2 of our instructors were special operations helicopter pilots. And so they had some of the coolest stories about these special operation missions that they were doing, either with Navy SEALs, Rangers, Delta, whatever, like doing all this really cool stuff. And it's like, yeah, that sounds like that's definitely what I want to do. And then about halfway through pilot training, I started, hearing all the other stories from the fighter community from some of those guys about like all the cool stuff. I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty cool too. So, so I ended up going the fighter track, and just very fortunate to have the grades and the aptitude and the performance to make that cut, and then eventually to go to the Strike Eagle, the F-15E.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure you have a ton of stories. I'd love to pick your brain about a lot of those stories. But I also want to be respectful of the time we have together. And so you have a transition from fighter pilot. What was cool also is that they have this switch training. It's, where once you're in the Air Force, the arms or the branches of the military will allow a switch so that you can get training on an aircraft. There's probably pretty few people every year that get that opportunity, but you had the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, there's called a exchange program, basically. So just like a foreign exchange student, if you will, and that's really kind of what it is, because you're a complete foreigner to that service. Because everything.
Do they treat you like that?
No, but
they don't harass you or heckle you or anything.
Yeah, they kind of poke fun at you about certain things, because I mean it's just the way inter-service rivalries are. But it's a really good program, and you're right. There's not a lot of those opportunities because for the program that I was doing, basically it's one pilot doing that, and then I get replaced with somebody else at the end of my tour. Now they'll have for the F-18 exchange program, there's several of them. Like the one I was doing was down in Beaufort, South Carolina, but they have several up at Norfolk, Virginia, and they've got a couple other ones. And then they even have one down in Australia that you can do as well. And that's actually with the Australian Air Force down there. So there's different programs like that. I mean, it's fascinating because it gives you a completely different exposure to how either another branch of service or even another country operates from a military perspective.
I'm sure. And even what is the value to the U.S. government of having a pilot like you that can do both of those things? Is it just sort of this bonus that's like, it's a cool service and you're already a good pilot, and they're saying, look, this is kind of a thing that you now can get to learn, is like now you can land on aircraft carriers. And it's just sort of a kind of a mark that keeps you involved and engaged? Or is there an additional value to the U.S. government by cross-training people?
That's a great question. The main benefit to the military is you gain that exposure and the training, really perspective for joint operations in the future. Because from a leadership perspective, for any type of a general that's going to be, some sort of a combined forces component commander, that sort of thing, running a large operation down the road, you're going to have all the services involved, or at least more than one service involved. And so you gain really the program that I did, you gain an inherent understanding of how the Marine Corps operates, how they deploy, how they integrate with the ground units, like the whole structure of the Marine Corps, all that stuff. And a lot of that, you can get a little bit of it in theory by reading and going through, military college and stuff like that. But until you're actually living it and deploying with them and operating within that environment, you gain a true appreciation for how that works and the pieces of it where you go, okay, well, now I understand what this means when I read about this, right? So now if I'm ever in charge of like a joint service and I need to, do some sort of integration, like I know a little bit better the way to approach that.
So then that takes you kind of out of the service. So again, you spent about 17, 20 years in the service. You retired, right? You were able to retire.
Yeah.
So enough time to retire. And then, I feel like you had all of this experience, all of this knowledge of inter-service and sort of probably one of the highest level. I mean, everybody that serves, obviously tons of respect and all of that kind of stuff. And thank you for your service.
Sure.
But you probably had a lot of upward trajectory, or possibly, if you would have stayed in the service. What took you the other direction?
Well, when it comes to the military, the military is interesting.
Was it COVID? Was it COVID?
No, it wasn't COVID.
Okay.
I got out. My last flight was in December of 2019. And so that was when I had my retirement ceremony, and my official retirement date was May of 2020. So I was on what we call terminal leave, basically burning through all my saved up leave days when COVID happened. Without getting too much into the weeds on like how the military does its leadership training and stuff like that, those exchange programs, they are geared towards helping you gain that exposure, so that way you can contribute to the joint service in the future down the road. Those type of assignments where you have that ability to do that typically aren't going to happen until after your 20-year career in the Air Force. The reason why is because in the Air Force, your typical trajectory will be taking on some sort of, director of operations role at a squadron level. So think of like COO of an organization, right around your 15-year point, something like that. Mm-hmm. And then, by your 16 or 17-year point, you should be taking on some sort of squadron commander role. And so in charge of, maybe about 20 aircraft, 20, 30 aircraft, and about 100 pilots, that sort of thing, or maybe probably not 100 pilots, but about 50 pilots. And then from there, now you kind of go on to another military college, a staff assignment, that sort of thing. And then you eventually, when you get into that level where you're doing those joint types of operations, you're at a general officer level. So that's really around, 25 or 26 years in the service. And what happens is the Air Force tries to identify who those officers are going to be, in terms of the future general officers. Mm-hmm. Really, by the time you're like at year 10 in the service,
they got you.
They're trying to plan ahead. And the problem is the way they do the leadership stuff. Like everybody's got their, all of the senior leaders, they kind of have their own idea of like, okay, this is my guy. I think this guy should be it. But then like he gets moved on to a different assignment, so he doesn't get a say anymore. And somebody else comes in. He's like, no, this is my guy. Like I want him to be on this path. And so a lot of it is timing, and a lot of it is knowing, who's in charge at what levels and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, for me, that exchange assignment, as valuable as it was, I feel like a lot of that got lost because I was essentially disconnected from the Air Force system for 3 years. And so when I came back to the Air Force, I have people that had no idea who I was because the leaders that put me on that path to go do that assignment had long been gone and moved on or retired or done something else. And now I'm coming back and I'm like, okay, well, who is this guy Hoover that's coming back to us? Like, does anybody know anything about him? I don't know. He's coming from exchange assignment. Okay. Well, so there were some challenges with that. And that was the only regret I have about how that all played out was that I wish somebody had educated me more and provided some mentoring about, okay, well, when you go do this exchange assignment, here's how you need to stay connected back to the Strike Eagle community in terms of your leadership development. Because I really had no point of contact for that. And I'm not blaming them because, a lot of them, you don't know what you don't know. Right. Yeah. And a lot of them, the leaders, they're like, oh yeah, this is a good assignment. Let's send Hoover, he's capable, qualified, and, he'd be a great fit for that. But they didn't know to advise me on that because it's not something they had ever dealt with before because they had never done an exchange assignment themselves, Yeah. So,
yeah, one of the business principles that you just mentioned is even just the longevity of your business or of your practice. And some of that is identifying, long in advance, which the military clearly does very well, like who's going to succeed, or who's going to succeed. Yeah. Who's going to succeed the current leadership and the current culture, and building them way in advance. But one of the downsides that you said is that if they don't have a plan to keep those people connected, then they may not be the people that you really wanted in place when you had the opportunity to have that change. So yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Well, yeah. And then, like for my last assignment, that was the offer that I was given. It was like, hey, do you want to come back, to this assignment to fly the Strike Eagle? And we're going to make you a director of operations, for one of the squadrons here to kind of keep me going down that path. I said, yeah, sure. That'd be great. Well, by the time I got to that, I got that offer about 6 months or so before I ended up actually getting there. And so by the time I actually make the move to that base, the person that had me in that plan, he was the commander of the base. He had moved on to another assignment. So now a new commander comes in and I'm not in his plan. So, he'd already had in his mind, like, here's the guys that I want. And so, and I mean, I don't care. It's, I think at the time I was a little miffed by it. But hindsight being 2020, like it was really probably the best thing for me, because that's what put me into the safety position that I ended up taking as the chief of wing safety for the base. So overseeing all the aviation mishaps, the ground safety, OSHA compliance, that sort of stuff.
That makes more sense. Okay.
And so that got me on that trajectory, and that's, here I am today doing that.
Well, so yeah. I mean, so then you kind of, my recollection, is that you eventually got your retirement, and then you started flying for kind of a private charter company, and while you were waiting to get on with the big boys. Now you're on with the big boys, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how do you like that? Is it a different thought process?
It's very different than private charter flying.
Okay.
It's
how so?
I mean, it's just it's the airlines are, let me just say, like every company that's in the business to provide a air travel as a service is safety focused, or I'd like to feel like they're safety focused first, from an airline industry perspective. When you get up to the commercial airliners, which are what we call Part 121 carriers, they're held to the absolute highest standards when it comes to safety. Part 135, which is a private charter, is held to I mean, it is a lower level of safety, but it's still safe, if that makes sense, and the reason why it's a little bit different is private charter, you never know what the customer is going to want. Right. So there's certain things you can't predict in terms of, like, a private charter company can't forecast, okay, next month we know we're going to have this many trips to Turks and Caicos, right? Like they just don't know, because it's, people book stuff at the last minute. I need a private jet to take me from point A to point B. Whereas the airlines, they do such long range forecasting. I already know, like, for what's going to happen, as a pilot, I can see what's happening next month. But on the back end at the company level, they've got these schedules built out for probably the entire year, because they know when they're going to get more aircraft, less aircraft. And it's a very structured route. You're flying almost the exact same routes every single time. They know what the loads are seasonally with the passengers, how much cargo they can take versus passengers, all that stuff. And so it's just that's why it's, I want to say it's held to a higher safety standard, because everything is known. There's
so predictable.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's the only uncertainty that happens is once you actually push off the gate, and that's where, the pilots get paid to do their job, because that's when it's okay. Well, now there's a delay on the ground. Okay. Well, we've got weather. We've got this issue with this passenger. We've got something else going on that we have to deal with, and so that's where the uncertainty lies. And that's why we have, kind of developed this risk mitigation system to trap those errors before that they end up, turning into something worse. So,
yeah. Gosh. So I got to stay focused because there's so much I want to talk about, but I've got like 3 or 4 other follow-up questions to that. So here's what I want to ask. I'm a general aviation pilot. I've had my pilot's license now for a year. I'm working on my instrument rating, and I've got 9 kids. Hoover, I know you've got 3 boys. Is that right?
2 girls and a boy.
2 girls and a boy. Okay. And I was really moved when you mentioned that on your episode you did a couple of weeks ago now. So thanks for that. Cause it sort of speaks to me as well, is like my whole focus is, One of my identities as a human, and probably specifically as a man, is I like to do hard things. I like to challenge myself, and I like to kind of explore ideas and explore new things. And that's one of the things that I really love about aviation. And I do that. I apply that with my practice, and I apply it with the consulting business that I have as well. But my goodness, I am, on the one hand, I'm very concerned about safety for myself and for my passengers. But also, so that's what kind of drew me to what you do. Mm-hmm. But general aviation, you mentioned safety in part 121 and part 131. General aviation, I would say FAA is really focused on safety as well. Mm-hmm. But you do get, and everybody I've trained with, I mean, pretty much everybody I know I can pick out pilots who are a little more conservative and a little less conservative, but for the most part, like, I feel like people are really, that I fly around, are really very safe. Like, they want to make sure this plane is safe to fly, and they want to make good decisions. And so that's why I like what you're doing. How much general aviation experience do you have? Do you have a plane? Do you fly for fun?
I don't.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Do you have any desire to?
A little bit, but honestly, not really. And it's not because I wouldn't enjoy it. It's because from a risk management perspective, like, I have a good career with the airlines, like, I've got a family, and at the end of the day, I mean, as we saw with Richard McSpadden.
I was going to ask you about him. Great. I'm glad you brought him up.
I mean, so here's a guy who was like, just a great example of aviation safety and safety focus, and, bad things can still happen. Right.
Yeah.
Because all it takes is like one wrong decision at the last second, or whatever, to all of a sudden be involved in a tragedy. And so for me, like, as much fun as I know I'd have a ton of fun doing general aviation flying, but I got to weigh the risk, and, I'll probably take it up as my kids get older. And that way, like, I'm not worried as much about, like, okay, if something happens to me, at least all my kids are gone out of the house now and they're on their own, but at the ages they're at, there's that component of it. But also the other component of it is I have zero time to do something like that, between flying for the airlines and trying to do the YouTube videos and run that business of YouTube. And it's a lot, on top of the kids, managing all that, as I'm sure so.
Yeah. Cooper Vision and the AOA have joined forces in a groundbreaking initiative to transform how optometrists treat children with myopia. The Myopia Collective aims to unite our profession and its allies to challenge the status quo and elevate the standard of care for children with myopia. Everyone is invited to become a member of the collective. By joining, you pledge to act in slowing childhood myopia progression. Membership includes regular updates and information about the collective's efforts, access to educational opportunities and resources, and insights from the ambassador optometrists who advocate for community policy and changes supporting the collective's mission. Click the link in the show notes to join the collective today. As you know, patients with vitreous floaters are often frustrated by their symptoms. The challenge as clinicians is to offer solutions for our patients for vitreous floaters that are effective. But more often than not, the options of YAG vitreolysis and vitrectomy are not practical because the benefits don't outweigh the risks. That's where Vitreous Health from MacuHealth comes into play. Previously on the podcast, I've discussed the FLIES study with Dr. John Nolan, and the bottom line is that I can be confident prescribing this for my patients with floaters because I can tell them a large randomized placebo-controlled trial found that after 6 months of supplementation with Vitreous Health, floaters were reduced in size by approximately 30%, and 70% of patients had an improvement in their symptoms. Vitreous Health has been great for my patients, and we really feel like we have a viable option to treat patients with vitreous floaters now that we didn't have before. If you're not utilizing Vitreous Health for your patients, reach out to your MacuHealth representative now. No, I get it. I mean, I totally get it. I think, you if you were to ask me, I mean, I see patients. I have a practice that I own, and I see patients. I love that. But if you were to ask me, like, well, Chris, would you, I don't know. I mean, kind of the equivalent where I'm practicing at a really high level in my day-to-day business. Would I want to go back and, and maybe do something that would be considered perhaps more remedial? maybe I'd have fun doing it, but if it had some risk to it that I couldn't control, where I'm really used to controlling safety and risk and all of these things over here, and there was a little less of that control over there, I probably would be in the same boat as you. It's making me so then how hard did Richard McSpadden shake you? Cause it shook me when, I remember I was flying. So I live in Omaha, and I was flying to Rapid City, which is about in a 182, it's probably a 3-hour flight with relatively decent winds, like kind of moderate headwind from Omaha to Rapid. And I was like, I saw that, and I think it happened maybe the week before I was going on that flight, and it rocked me. I was really glad I had another buddy who's got his commercial rating and instrument rating, and he was coming with me anyway, and so I felt more safety in that regard. But man, I was like, if it can happen to him, and he's like the impossible turn guy, and I mean, what do you make of that? And he was an Air Force pilot, flying fighter jets.
Yeah, it's tough. I think the thing that I take away from that is that people need to realize is that no matter what your level of preparation is, bad things can sometimes still happen, right? I would never consider him to be someone that was negligent or reckless in anything that he did. But, that's just the nature of aviation. It is inherently a risky business. Do I worry about that before every flight? No. It's not something that overly concerns me. One of the reasons why I don't necessarily do general aviation flying, though, is because, I mentioned the risk level, but the reason why I see it for me as a risk at this point is I probably couldn't commit to it enough to be consistent with it, And so, and this has nothing to do with Richard McSpadden, by the way.
Sure. Yeah.
It's just that, if you're going to pursue aviation, I know you're working on your instrument rating. Like the biggest things that I find are pilots, when they're involved in these mishaps, maybe they're not consistent enough with their flying or their training, right? So you get an instrument rating and then you don't use it. You're doing the bare minimum number of approaches to maintain your recency requirements. Then all of a sudden you plan a flight, and then the weather rolls in because maybe you knew there was going to be some weather, but now the ceilings are lower than you expected. And now you're having to shoot a full instrument approach at an airfield that you haven't been to before, you haven't flown the approach before. And you're like, oh, I've got my instrument rating, I can do this. And the autopilot's working, but then the autopilot stops working. And you're, like that's all it takes is maybe you program the autopilot wrong and you just don't have enough experience to know that, because you're not using your skill set enough to be comfortable or what's the right word?
Well, there's proficient and then there's current.
To be proficient.
Yep.
Yeah. You're not doing enough to be proficient. And so for me as a general aviation pilot, I could probably fly around and keep myself safe. Would I feel comfortable though? Like probably not 100%, because if all of a sudden I lost an engine or had some other malfunction with the aircraft, if I'm only flying once every 3 months, doing general aviation, because that's what my schedule allows, well, crap, am I going to be able to react quickly enough to do what I need to do? I don't know. So,
yeah, I mean, that's one of my biggest fears so I'm not all that, for me, where I'm again, pretty, I mean, I am concerned obviously, but when I think about my instrument rating, and then maybe my commercial rating, maybe a CFI, it's mostly about just becoming better, like a better pilot over time, and having a goal and kind of achieving that goal. I don't think, my goal would not be to push the minimums, even if I look at flying down to the minimums, do I need to be able to do it? Sure. Do I want to be as good of it as possible? But am I actually going to fly on days where it's minimums? I just won't do it. Right. Now, as you said, am I going to, what I worry about is, am I going to have the decision-making skills when I look at the cloud level and it's above minimums for the approach, but kind of maybe at the threshold of where I'm comfortable, and then it drops. Am I going to have the decision-making capabilities to make a diversion to a different airport? That's something that I guess you can't know until you get there. But I'm hoping that, well, are there good techniques that you use to know that you'd advise me to say, like, listen, Chris, you write this down and you stick to it and you never deviate from that? Like, what can I do as a pilot to be safer there?
I think at the end of the day, you've got to really, remove the emotion from the equation. So when I say that, it's okay, well, why am I doing this flight? Maybe I'm going to see family or something like that. And so if I miss the flight, like, my family's not going to see me, whatever. So, like, take that emotion out and go, like, well, what's the safest thing to do here? And I give you an example because this is really, I think, pertinent, because I just finished filming this video. So this video is going to be out this Sunday. You've got a pilot who's got 3,000 hours. He's been flying since the 90s, all GA stuff, very familiar with the aircraft, comfortable using the aircraft, all that stuff, right? Instrument rated. He's going to do a flight from Columbus, Georgia to Raleigh. And so a couple hour flight, not too far. He's flying with his wife, going to see some friends as part of their vacation. My guess is when he planned the trip, he didn't think as much about when sunset was. I'm sure he looked at the weather. There wasn't enough in the NTSB report to kind of provide that level of fidelity. But the weather forecast, basically, you had some broken clouds between about 1,000 and 3,000 feet, so not terrible. And you can certainly shoot a visual approach once you get below 1,000 feet. Like, that's not near the minimums, Yep. He's got a, GPS on the aircraft. He's capable of shooting an RNAV GPS approach down below the weather. And so he goes and conducts this flight. Well, when he flew into Raleigh, they've got two main parallel runways. So one that the airliners use, and then one that usually the airliners sometimes use, but it's also for general aviation stuff. Mm-hmm. Well, of those two main parallel runways, one of them was closed. So they're down to a single runway, but then they have a perpendicular runway. It's only about 3,000 feet. And that's really like for like the local flying, like flight school type stuff. Right. So he planned on shooting one of these approaches to, the standard, parallel runways. And as soon as he checked in, like, oh, hey, that's, if we want to get you in, we can work you in, but it's going to be a delay. And he's probably looking at the situation. He's going, well, it's, sunset is right around this time. So it's starting to get a little bit dark outside. And he probably didn't want to delay any further after flying for 2.5 hours. So he said, okay, I'll take the approach to the perpendicular runway. That's not a problem. Well, long story short, basically the guy hadn't flown an instrument approach in almost a full year, and he hadn't flown at night in a full year. And so now he's flying this approach at night in the weather, and then the autopilot fails. And so he's able to recover the aircraft. And then for about the next 30 minutes, he's like, fighting the aircraft because he can't get the autopilot to couple with the GPS to do what he's wanting it to do for this RNAV GPS approach. And he does a really great job of like talking to the controller. So that I talk about a lot of that in the video and what the controller was doing to help him. And in hindsight, like if he had just taken a step back, he should have gone like, I'm having trouble with my autopilot and coupling to the GPS. Why don't I just go back to flying the ILS, to one of the primary runways and take the delay? But like he became so focused on like, I have to do this approach to this other runway because all the airliners are using the main runway. And the controller, honestly, he was so far behind the jet that the controller kept giving him this plan of like, okay. And the controller was very patient with him. He's like, okay, I see that you're at 4,400 feet, and, can you descend when able? And he couldn't descend. So he's like, okay, why don't you just maintain 4,400? Okay, well, I see that you just missed that fix, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. We're going to get you to the next fix, like, and the controller was really helping him out and doing the right thing. But the pilot should have just said, like, the GPS isn't working, man. Like
Mm-hmm.
I haven't done something like this in a year. Like, let me go
Yeah.
fly the ILS at least to get below the weather. And I'll save the ending for the video, but the
Yeah,
bottom
please.
line is he does get under the weather. He reports the airport in sight or the runway in sight, but then he crashes.
Mm.
And it had nothing to do with the autopilot or the GPS.
Well,
So people
it's
have to
almost
watch the
like,
video to find out.
yeah. So we'll link to that video. If I don't know if you want to email me a link to that video, because we'll put it in the show notes today. And this will come out in a probably a week or two after you release the video, so it'll be available if you want to email that to me. So when I listen to that, here's what I take home from it is almost every single mishap that you go over and that I've heard, it's not just one thing. It's not just an engine fire or an electrical fire. It's not just, it's just this compounding scenario of, one thing after the other. And too often it's like getting fixated on one thing. So it's like, if you just break that cycle, if you can do something where it's like something goes wrong and you get fixated on something, it's like, if I can break that cycle and then move on to the next thing, or like, your instruments aren't working. I've just listened to a mishap recently where the attitude indicator wasn't working. And then the pilot became fixated on the attitude indicator. And if it wasn't for the co-pilot that he had next to him, it was just I think it was a Cessna, but that said airspeed, airspeed, airspeed. He stopped his scan. He stopped his instrument scan. He was fixated on that one thing. And it was that breaking of like, hey, focus on what you're supposed to be doing. That's why we do it. If he didn't have somebody sitting next to him who knew better, he would have crashed the plane. It would have stalled and plane would have spun down to the ground.
Yeah. Single pilot IFR in the weather at night is not a fun place to be. Even if your autopilot's working, it's not a place I would want to be, like, no matter how many hours I have, because you're just never comfortable. Right. Having another pilot with you to, hey, I'm going to fly. I'm going to focus on the instruments. You brief me on the approach, and I want you to back me up on the altitudes. So that all goes into the planning and the briefing, and that's why I think the airline industry does it so well, is because we have, we brief everything. We talk about, okay, this is what we're going to do for the approach, but as a secondary, if we don't get this approach, here's our backup plan, and let's talk about that. And oh, by the way, if we have to go around, let's brief the go around procedure. So that way we know what we're going to do. And what happens if we go around at low altitude as we're near the runway, or what happens if we have to go around, we're above 1,000 feet, because those procedures are a little bit different. Right. When you're flying single pilot, you have to brief yourself on all those things. And now not only do you have to brief yourself, but you've got to fly the aircraft at the same time and continue to keep your cross scan going with everything. And the autopilot certainly helps, but that's where I think in this scenario, in this video, I thought the guy did a really great job, because he kept using the controller. He's like, okay, it looks like I'm showing myself on a heading of 140. What do you see? And the controller would verify that stuff for him, or he'd say, okay, how's my altitude look? He asked the controller at one point, okay, your altitude's fine. So he was using the resources he had available to him to do that. But it's tough when you're by yourself,
Yeah.
And like you said, you need somebody to break you out of that, to go, hey, have you thought about doing this instead?
Yeah. Yeah. I felt that way. Obviously I'm still in what they would call the killing zone. Although you've probably read that book.
It's a terrible term for that.
Yeah, I know. But but I'm not sure he really makes what I like about the book is it shows all the mishaps that people have. I got to go back and reread it, but I walked away thinking like there wasn't really a big disparity between, because you go over tons of mishaps that people have 3,000 hours, 15,000 hours. So I don't think that the case is made in that book very well that 50 to 350 hours is really a killing zone, dramatically different than other people outside of it. But one of the things that the points that they made, which I want you to respond to, and then I want to divert and talk about debriefing for businesses, because I think that's where you have a lot of value for us. And I think you have a lot of value in maybe there's some of the things you want to do in the future. But his point was, how do we train pilots in the military with 400 hours of flying time? And they are the best pilots in the world after 400 hours. We're doing something wrong in general aviation. What could we do differently? What do you think about that proposal?
The military aviation training structure is just so different than general aviation, at least from what I know from general aviation training, because I just can't imagine it being the same way the military does.
Correct.
And even like the Air Force and the Navy do things way differently, but still produce kind of the same, essentially the same caliber of pilot at the end of the training pipeline. From an Air Force perspective, I'm sitting in 12 hours of classes for 6 weeks doing academics before I even start flying, 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, going over this stuff. Right. And you're learning all of the aircraft systems, everything about the aircraft, that sort of stuff too, along with all the emergencies. And then even when you start flying, you're doing, your class will do something called, I'm assuming they still do this. At least I hope they still do. We would do something called daily stand-up. So the whole class would, show up for work, at 6 o'clock in the morning, and you'd be sitting around, the room there, and one of the students or a couple of the students would be called to stand up, and they would be given an emergency scenario. They'd say, okay, well, you're flying in the pattern, and you just got this indication in the aircraft, and this is your situation. Here's how much fuel you have on board. All right, you have the aircraft. And then you stand at attention, and you're like, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is maintain aircraft control. Then I'm going to analyze the situation, take the proper action. Then I'm going to land as soon as conditions permit. Okay, when I go to maintain aircraft control, here's what I'm going to do. And then in order to analyze the situation, here's what's going to, and then you're walking through the emergency procedure and everything. And that is such a structured part of every single day for 6 months, day in and day out. And then with your flights, the briefing and the debrief is, for at least even going through like my ATP, doing that with a local flight school, the military just does that debrief process. So it's so much more in depth than what the general aviation side does. I think that's a huge player in that. And then also it's the consistency with the flying. So you're getting flight after flight after flight. Whereas I think for a lot of general aviation pilots, like you're doing this on the side, you've got family, you've got jobs, you got other stuff going on. And so you may not get to fly like every single day, and you probably may not even get to fly, twice a week, or whatever the case is. And so that's probably the disparity and the challenge, I think, between the military and general aviation. Overall,
I think that's great. I want to take that point and segue, because one of the things I think is that I think would be beneficial for my audience to hear, but also kind of beneficial for you, because I think you can help a lot of people just in their businesses. And I know you are kind of thinking about how to incorporate your skills as a pilot and the pilot briefing and the really detailed pilot debriefing that you're used to help businesses. So tell me about, when I walk out of a patient, like when I walk out of an exam room, I'm not consistently thinking. I do think about this a little bit. I think about it more probably now as a pilot than I did before. But like, how could I have communicated better to the patient? How could I have helped the patient with navigating this decision that we need to make? That's on the one side. And the other side, it's like, well, how do I really go back and look at, like, we wanted to do this new thing in business, in my practice, and I'm not purposeful as much as I should be about like what went right, what went wrong, how do we assess that? So what's kind of your thought in a debrief that could be helpful to me or to the listeners about those sorts of things?
Well, I think no matter what your line of business is or what you're doing, the very first thing you need to do in order to debrief is you need to have clearly defined objectives or outcomes. So, for a surgeon, or whatever, a first responder, maybe it's like, I want to have zero loss of life, right? That's my number one objective. I don't want anyone to ever die while I'm trying to save them or work on them or whatever, and it's not always going to be attainable, right? Especially for a first responder, because they don't know what kind of type of situation they're going to be presented with. But if that's their clearly defined objective from the beginning, or at least one of their objectives, now they have something to debrief to go, well, the patient died. Okay, well, now let's look at why they died. Okay, did it have to do with our plan? Did it have to do with, the equipment that we had? Maybe we didn't have the right equipment that we needed on our ambulance or in the fire truck or whatever. Or did it have to do with our execution? And when it comes to the execution, we want to look at, was it a perception issue? Was it a decision, or was it an execution issue? In terms of like, maybe I perceived that this was the problem, and so I applied these steps, and then that's really where things went wrong. Mm-hmm. Or maybe I made a bad decision, and and that led to this, which led to that, right? Or it was an execution error where we perceived the problem correctly, we made a decision on what we were going to do, but when it came to execute that, we messed it up because we didn't have enough training to do that. Mm-hmm. So the perception, decision, execution is a big part of the debrief process, but having those clearly defined objectives is where you need to start. And for a business, maybe that's like, we just worked I just went to a seminar with like a shipping company. So for a shipping company, they want to have, zero safety incidents on their voyages from port to port. Okay, well, how do we get there? Well, first we have to have that as an objective, so that way we can have something to debrief to. Because if you don't have those objectives, then like, how do you know, what to measure yourself against, so that way you can improve for next time, right? So
we start with so those objectives would be clearly defined, and then we'd probably brief those objectives at the beginning. So, in my business, it might be, look, I want to do a better job of detecting a patient with this ocular disease. Let's say it's glaucoma, for example, and I want to do a better job of detecting patients with glaucoma. And my objective would be that nobody loses vision from glaucoma. Okay, that might be the big overarching objective. And then we'd brief the whole team on that and say, okay, well, our responsibility in order to identify everybody that comes into our practice, that correctly identify them as having a risk for glaucoma and also then having glaucoma, we want to identify those patients. And when they come in, when we identify them, then we say, okay, this is our objective. Nobody loses vision from glaucoma. Then from there, it's okay, we're going to lay these steps out in place to identify those patients. And then we're going to use our technical capabilities to decide what treatments are best options for those patients. And that's going to occur individually on every single patient. And then, at some interval in the future, which is kind of challenging with glaucoma because it's a chronic disease that, I always make the comment, like, you never know how good of a glaucoma doctor you are until the end of your career, because it's generally not a condition that will take sight like that. It takes it gradually over time. So then it's kind of like, well, now it's kind of ambiguous. So how could I put things in place? But there's things that you could do. You could look at like, oh man, I've done this. I've seen a patient where, some of our testing that we do on a glaucoma patient, it's variable, where you might look at the test and you might say, well, I'm not sure how much stock I put in this one test today, but we're going to repeat it. So we put things in place to say, we're going to repeat this test in a month or 3 months or 6 months. And then it becomes clear. And you're like, sometimes you're looking at it and it's like, oh man, well, 6 months down the line, I got this patient. I know that we've got progression or we've got glaucoma that's developed. And then I look back 6 months and I'm like, oh, I should have seen it there. But it's so clear at that 6 month mark. But the point is that we put steps in place so that, it wasn't clear 6 months ago. It seems clear now, but it wasn't clear 6 months ago. It's kind of ambiguous and uncertain. So we didn't hurt the patient because we put those things in place. But had we not put those things in place, had we just done the test, 6 months ago and be like, oh, it's fine, let's check it again in 2 years. Now you're like, oh, So I guess, what's your reaction to that? Is that a good thought process? Are there things I'm missing within that?
I mean, so the way I would
Obviously, you
look
don't
at
know about
this,
glaucoma,
yeah,
but
I mean, the way I would look at this is like, when a true, the style of a fighter pilot debrief is, and I kind of walk through this a little bit with the Dallas Air Show, because
oh yeah,
even though all of my other debriefs use a lot of these principles, it's not quite the same as a fighter pilot debrief. And the debrief always starts with the plan. Okay, what was the plan? So if your objective is, zero
vision loss. Yep.
vision loss or whatever. Okay, well, what's our plan to achieve that? So how are we going to do that? Okay. So the plan is this. And so you lay out the steps and how we're going to execute that. And then the next thing for the debrief would be the products for a fighter pilot. And the products is all the paperwork that conveys all the, here's the steps of the plan. So that way, when I'm flying in the jet and I need to quickly reference, like, what was I supposed to do next? Okay, I'm supposed to drop my bomb at this point or whatever, that sort of thing. So I have that. From a business perspective, the products would be like the resources that you have available and the tools that you have available to aid you in accomplishing your plan.
Great. Perfect.
So maybe that's a piece
I
of
have
equipment.
this test and
Yeah.
optic nerve OCT, a visual field, gonioscopy. Yep. Just, perfect.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Exactly.
The listeners know what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have all that stuff. Those are the what I would call the products, right? Because that helps you identify like a resource issue. Like maybe we don't have the resources to execute our plan, and then the next piece that you would look at is the briefing, at least for the fighter pilot community. For a business, the briefing would be, as a leader or as a business owner, how are you communicating this to all the members of your team to make them a part of that plan and make them a part of that objective? Because is it going to be you doing all of these diagnoses yourself, or are you going to rely on your team to do that? And if your team has a role in that, then they need to understand the plan. They need to understand the tools and the resources they have available to execute that plan. And then you need to tell them, like, here's what we're going to do. Right. And so now when you go to evaluate, 5 years down the road, or maybe it's a year down the road or whatever, you can look back and you can go, well, I told Betty that this was the plan and this was our objective and these were the resources, but I learned that Betty didn't really know how to use this piece of equipment in the correct way. And I didn't know that as the leader. So that's my fault. And I need to make a better training program for this piece of equipment. Or maybe we're not doing patient follow-up to the degree that we need to meet our objective. And that's something that ties in with like our plan, so there's having that objective, having that plan, identifying the resources, briefing that plan. And then now you can go back and you can start to poke holes in it and go, okay, well, this person, ended up having glaucoma and lost their vision, why did that happen?
We missed it. We could have done it sooner So what's really interesting to me is what you've laid out is, so we see these things time and time. I mean, I was not intentionally doing what you're doing, but actually, like, we've helped hundreds of practices across the country. And essentially it's the same thing that you're describing. Although I don't describe it as eloquently as you do. And what I find in a lot of cases, and it doesn't matter how well somebody's trained, is that we can get lulled into a sense of complacency and taking a step back and be like, oh, this patient will do fine. I've got the clinical skills to get myself out of this. If something goes wrong, we've got the acumen to be better. You know what I mean? Like you can get, the longevity that occurs in practices and in physicians. If you're not intentional about looking at every one of those steps, what are our protocols? What's a preferred practice pattern? What's a clinical practice guideline? How am I going to incorporate that clinical practice guideline into my practice? And then how am I going to adhere to it rigorously? Because I'll tell you what happens is you'd be like, well, this patient doesn't need that. I don't want to over test them. And I don't want to, but like, if your goal is 0, right? And obviously like there is this wiggle room in human things, but like, I always encourage doctors when we're working with them to say, like, if I'm going to deviate from a preferred practice pattern or clinical practice guideline, I should have a really good reason why I would deviate with it. And I should find myself not deviating from that very often, right? So like I shouldn't probably do less than what that says, except in very rare instances for very specific patients. And I think that's what you're saying. It's like, look, I mean, I know that you're not saying that because of this specific disease state, but I think what you're saying is like you put a plan in place, and when it is on paper, on purpose, you're not going to deviate from it unless there's very specific situations. And that's where I find practices and physicians in general, where we wind up with problems. It's like, well, I don't know, this doesn't feel like something I need to this. So that they wind up getting away from those guidelines. And then pretty soon their practice has, like, the guidelines are very wishy-washy for them, and they're sort of flapping in the wind based on a lot less rigor.
Right.
Anyway, that's been my observation. I'm not sure I'm articulating that point well, but I hear you saying that. I'm like, oh, this is exactly what we coach people on every single time. Put it down on paper, look at it, stay to it. And, unless there's something that causes you to divert from that, it better be a good reason why you aren't going to stick to those plans. And then watch it and review it and communicate it is super important.
Well, the one thing I didn't talk about was the contingency piece of it, right? So every fighter pilot planning session, where we're getting ready for a mission, you're going to have your plan, you're going to start working on your products, but you always come up with a backup attack, like, okay, this is my primary attack, but if my GPS fails, how am I still going to get the bomb on target? Or what happens if, we go in with 4 jets, but we lose one? Because we've identified for this mission that even though we want no losses, on this mission, we're accepting a high level of risk, meaning like we might not all come home today. So if I lose one jet on the way to the target, how am I still going to execute my mission with the resources that I still have available? From a business perspective, it's as complicated as you want to make it in terms of your contingencies, so for you, maybe it's okay. Well, if this piece of equipment or this test that we do isn't available, what's our backup? If a patient, cause I could see that happening. A patient comes in, they were supposed to get supposed to get this test, and now it's not available or whatever. The machine's not working. Okay. Well, what's our plan for dealing with that, rather than just letting the staff or the team randomly figure out and apply their own methodology to doing that? So it's very simple. It doesn't need to be overly complicated, but it's just thinking through those things and identifying like those issues. And unfortunately, some of those issues and limitations, you can't really make that, you can't really identify them until you actually get into the debrief and you go, oh man, like we messed this up and here's why. Okay, now it's fixed for the next time. And we told Betty, this is what you're supposed to do next time or whatever, And it could also apply, like we've been talking about glaucoma, but it could be patient billing practices or something, something else. Like there's a whole, you can apply that debrief methodology to pretty much anything that you do in your business, where as long as you can identify, you have a clearly defined outcome that you can, measure yourself against, right, for what you want to accomplish, then you can walk that back and, apply the briefing and the debriefing methodology to that.
Hoover, I think you have a huge potential for helping businesses in that methodology. And I think there's probably nobody better than you to do it. I'm excited to see what you develop. I also want to be respectful of your time. I'm so grateful for you to take an hour of your day to come out and talk to me, with your family, with your flying, with your YouTube channel. Tell our audience where they can find you and how they can reach out or enjoy the same things I'm able to enjoy.
The easiest way to find me is go on YouTube and type in Pilot Debrief, and you can find the channel and watch a video. That's probably the best way to support the channel, is just watch some videos and share them with friends. If you're looking to find out more about me, maybe get yourself an F-15E Strike Eagle hat, that sort of thing. I got merchandise. You can go to my website, pilotdebrief.com. And the stuff that we're talking about here with the debrief methodology. That is something that we're working on for businesses. So that is something that I'm going to start rolling out on the website. We got the cart a little bit ahead of the horse, but we're writing, fixing our vector here and getting everything lined back up. So expect to see more on that on the website soon. But yeah, it's exciting stuff, so, and I'm happy to talk about it. I love talking about this stuff.
Awesome. Hoover, thanks so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.